The morning mist hung thick over the Kurdish mountains of northern Iraq as Joanna Polani checked her rifle one final time. The 2-3-year-old Danish-Kurdish sniper had earned a reputation that struck fear into the hearts of ISIS fighters across the region. They called her the Angel of Death, a name that followed her like a shadow through the valleys and ridgelines where she hunted the world's most dangerous terrorists. Joanna's journey to this moment began far from these war-torn landscapes. Born in a refugee camp to Kurdish parents fleeing Saddam Hussein's brutal regime, she grew up in Denmark, where safety and education were supposed to replace the violence her family had escaped. But the pull of her heritage proved stronger than the comfort of her adopted home. The teenager who once worried about school exams and weekend plans now lay motionless behind a boulder, watching through her scope as an ISIS convoy approached the valley below. Her spotter, a grizzled Peshmerga veteran named Ahmad, whispered distance calculations in her ear. 600 meters. Wind from the northeast, 3 vehicles carrying fighters who had terrorized innocent families across Syria and Iraq. What made Joanna different from other foreign fighters wasn't just her deadly accuracy with a rifle. It was her ability to think 3 steps ahead, to understand the psychology of her enemies, and to use their own tactics against them. While ISIS fighters expected to face battle-hardened Kurdish men, they never anticipated that their deadliest opponent would be a young woman who had traded her university textbooks for a sniper's manual. The convoy stopped at a checkpoint. Through her scope, Joanna could see the black flags fluttering from the vehicles. These same symbols had marked the sites of countless atrocities. Villages burned, families torn apart, children forced to become soldiers. The images that had driven her from her comfortable life in Copenhagen to this rocky outcrop thousands of miles from home. Ahmad tapped her shoulder twice. The signal. The lead vehicle's commander had stepped out, speaking animatedly into a radio. This was the target intelligence had identified, a mid-level commander responsible for coordinating attacks against civilian populations. Joanna controlled her breathing, felt her heartbeat slow, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the valley like thunder. The commander dropped instantly. Chaos erupted below as fighters scrambled for cover, unsure where the attack had come from. But Joanna was already moving, following an escape route she had memorized before taking her position. This was lesson 1 in her personal war against terror. Strike hard, strike clean, and disappear before the enemy could respond. Within minutes, she and Ahmad had melted back into the mountains, leaving behind only confusion and fear. The ISIS fighters would spend hours searching for ghosts, never knowing that their hunter was already miles away, planning the next operation. Word would spread through their communication networks about another successful strike by the mysterious sniper they could never find, never predict, never stop. Back at the Peshmerga base camp that evening, Joanna cleaned her rifle with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. The weapon had become an extension of herself, a tool for justice in a world where traditional law enforcement had failed. Each successful mission brought her closer to her ultimate goal. Not just eliminating individual terrorists, but breaking their will to fight. The other Kurdish fighters had initially been skeptical of the young woman from Denmark. How could someone raised in the safety of Western Europe understand the brutal realities of Middle Eastern warfare? But Joanna's actions had quickly earned their respect. She never asked for special treatment, never complained about the harsh conditions, and never hesitated when duty called. Her commanders began assigning her increasingly difficult missions: solo reconnaissance deep behind enemy lines, long-range elimination of high-value targets, psychological warfare operations designed to disrupt enemy morale. With each success, the legend of the Angel of Death grew stronger, and ISIS fighters became increasingly reluctant to operate in areas where she might be hunting. But Joanna's war was about more than individual kills or tactical victories. She understood that defeating ISIS required destroying their mystique of invincibility. Every successful operation, every eliminated commander, every disrupted plan chipped away at their propaganda machine. The group that claimed divine protection was being systematically dismantled by a young Kurdish woman with a rifle and an unshakable sense of justice. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. ISIS had built its recruitment strategy around the image of unstoppable holy warriors conquering weak enemies. Having their fighters terrorized by a female sniper they couldn't catch or kill undermined everything they claimed to represent. Joanna had become their worst nightmare. Proof that their ideology was as hollow as their military capabilities. Intelligence reports began filtering back through Kurdish networks. ISIS commanders were pulling their forces back from certain areas, afraid to operate where the Angel of Death might be watching. Recruitment in some regions had slowed as potential fighters heard stories of the mysterious sniper who seemed to appear and disappear like smoke. The psychological warfare was working exactly as Joanna had planned. Her radio crackled with the next day's mission briefing. Another convoy. Another opportunity to strike at the heart of the terror network. Joanna smiled grimly as she plotted routes on her tactical map. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to protect innocent people from those who would destroy them. The war was far from over, but every night brought her closer to the moment when ISIS fighters would be too afraid to leave their compounds, too demoralized to fight effectively, and too broken to threaten the people she had sworn to protect. The Angel of Death would continue her hunt until justice was served and peace could return to the mountains of Kurdistan. The intelligence briefing that morning changed everything. Major Hassan spread aerial photographs across the table in the command bunker, his weathered face grave as he pointed to a cluster of buildings in the Sinjar Mountains. An ISIS stronghold had been identified housing not just fighters, but dozens of captured Yazidi women and children being held as slaves. Joanna studied the photographs with the cold calculation that had made her the most feared sniper in the region. The compound sat on a ridge overlooking 3 valleys, strategically positioned to spot approaching enemies from any direction. Traditional assault would be suicide. Artillery bombardment would kill the captives. But a precision operation, executed with perfect timing and overwhelming psychological pressure, might save lives while eliminating the terrorists holding them. The mission would require everything she had learned in 18 months of combat. Not just marksmanship, but tactical planning, psychological warfare, and an understanding of how fear could be weaponized against those who thought themselves untouchable. The compound commander, identified as Abu Rashid, had earned a reputation for extreme brutality, even by ISIS standards. His elimination would send shockwaves through the entire terror network. Joanna spent 3 days studying the target, memorizing guard rotations, supply schedules, and communication patterns. She identified 17 armed fighters, 3 heavy weapons positions, and multiple escape routes. Most importantly, she located the building where the captives were being held, information that would be crucial for any rescue operation that might follow her initial strike. The approach would have to be made during the pre-dawn hours, when human alertness was naturally at its lowest point. Joanna and her spotter Ahmad began their infiltration at midnight, moving like shadows through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. Every step had to be calculated to avoid detection by sentries who had grown complacent in their mountain fortress. By 4 in the morning, they had reached an overwatch position 800 meters from the compound. Through her night vision scope, Joanna could see guards moving lazily between positions, confident that no enemy force could approach undetected. Their arrogance would cost them dearly. She settled into her firing position and began the methodical process of range estimation and environmental calculation that preceded every shot. The first target was the communications specialist, a bearded fighter who emerged from the radio room at precisely 4:30, following a routine he had maintained for weeks. One shot dropped him silently, cutting the compound's ability to call for reinforcements. The second target was the heavy weapons operator manning a machine gun nest overlooking the main approach route. Another precise shot eliminated that threat. Within 10 minutes, Joanna had systematically eliminated 6 key fighters without alerting the rest of the garrison. Each shot was calculated not just for lethality, but for maximum psychological impact. Bodies fell in positions where they would be discovered by their comrades, creating confusion and panic about the source of the attack. When the remaining fighters finally realized they were under assault, their response was exactly what Joanna had predicted. Instead of maintaining defensive positions, they began firing wildly into the darkness, wasting ammunition and revealing their locations. She picked them off methodically, using their panic against them while remaining completely invisible in her concealed position. Abu Rashid emerged from the main building, shouting orders and trying to rally his demoralized fighters. Through her scope, Joanna could see the terror in his eyes as he realized his supposedly impregnable fortress was being dismantled by an enemy he couldn't see or fight. This was the moment she had been preparing for. The psychological breaking point where fear would overcome training. The shot that eliminated Abu Rashid was heard by every remaining fighter in the compound. The man they had thought invincible, who had terrified captives and commanded absolute obedience, dropped like a stone. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Fighters who had been willing to die for their cause suddenly found themselves questioning everything they believed. What happened next surprised even Joanna. Instead of continuing to fight or attempting to escape, the remaining ISIS fighters began raising white flags and calling out surrender in Arabic and Kurdish. The loss of their leader, combined with the systematic elimination of their comrades by an enemy they couldn't locate, had shattered their will to resist. Ahmad grabbed the radio and called for immediate support. Kurdish forces had been positioned to respond quickly once the compound was secured, but no one had expected the entire operation to be completed by a single sniper. The rescue teams that arrived an hour later found shell-shocked terrorists sitting with their hands raised and captives who could barely believe their ordeal was over. The liberation of the compound yielded intelligence that would prove invaluable in future operations. Documents recovered from Abu Rashid's quarters revealed the locations of other ISIS facilities, the identities of key commanders, and plans for future attacks. More importantly, 37 Yazidi captives were freed, including children who had been held for months. News of the operation spread rapidly through both Kurdish and ISIS communication networks. For the Kurds, it represented hope that their most dangerous enemies could be defeated by superior tactics and unwavering determination. For ISIS, it was proof that their reign of terror was ending, picked apart by enemies they couldn't catch or kill. Joanna's reputation evolved from feared sniper to something approaching mythical status. ISIS fighters began refusing assignments to areas where she might be operating. Recruitment dropped in regions where her exploits were known. The psychological warfare she had been conducting was achieving results beyond what traditional military operations could accomplish. But the young Danish-Kurdish fighter knew that her most important battle still lay ahead. Intelligence indicated that a major ISIS leader was planning a massive retaliatory attack against Kurdish civilian targets. Stopping that operation would require not just individual marksmanship, but the kind of strategic thinking that could turn an entire enemy force against itself. The radio crackled with new orders. Another mission. Another opportunity to protect innocent people and strike at the heart of the terror network. Joanna checked her rifle and began studying the next target folder. The Angel of Death had more work to do, and ISIS was about to learn that their worst nightmares were just beginning. The intercepted radio transmission changed everything about how Kurdish intelligence viewed the ISIS threat. A senior commander known only as the Ghost was coordinating a massive operation designed to strike at Kurdish civilian populations across 3 provinces simultaneously. The attack would target schools, hospitals, and marketplaces where families gathered, turning everyday life into a nightmare of random violence. Joanna listened to the recording in the secure briefing room. Her jaw clenched as translators explained the scope of the planned atrocity. 200 fighters were being positioned across the region, armed with explosives, chemical weapons, and orders to maximize civilian casualties. Traditional military responses would be too slow and too scattered to prevent the coordinated strikes. Intelligence had identified the operations command center in an abandoned oil refinery near the Syrian border. The facility housed not just the Ghost and his planning staff, but also the communications equipment coordinating the entire network of attack cells. Destroying the command structure would leave the scattered fighters without coordination, turning a sophisticated military operation into a collection of isolated groups that could be defeated individually. The mission would be Joanna's most ambitious yet. The refinery complex covered several square kilometers, with multiple buildings, guard towers, and defensive positions. Over 60 fighters protected the facility, including some of ISIS's most experienced veterans. A traditional assault would require an entire battalion and result in heavy casualties on both sides. But Joanna had spent months studying how terror organizations thought and operated. Their strength came from their ability to coordinate multiple operations while remaining invisible to conventional military forces. If she could disrupt their command structure and create enough chaos within their ranks, the entire network might collapse without a single conventional battle. The plan she developed was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to fight 60 defenders simultaneously, she would turn them against each other by creating the impression that their security had been compromised from within. A series of precisely targeted eliminations, combined with carefully planted evidence, would convince the paranoid leadership that they were facing betrayal from their own ranks. Joanna spent a week conducting reconnaissance on the refinery, learning guard patterns, supply schedules, and the personalities of key commanders. She identified 4 senior lieutenants who had been competing for the Ghost's favor, each suspicious of the others and ready to believe in treachery. These rivalries would become the foundation for her psychological operation. The first phase began before dawn on a Tuesday morning. Joanna eliminated a guard at the eastern checkpoint, but left behind evidence suggesting the attack had come from inside the compound. A cigarette butt from a brand favored by one of the competing lieutenants. Boot prints leading toward the western section where his rival maintained his quarters. Small details that would raise questions in already suspicious minds. Within hours, accusations were flying between the rival factions. The eastern lieutenant accused his western counterpart of eliminating a loyal guard to cover his own treachery. The western lieutenant responded with counter-accusations and demands for a full investigation. The Ghost found himself mediating between subordinates instead of planning attacks against Kurdish civilians. Joanna continued her campaign of strategic elimination and misdirection. Each death was accompanied by evidence pointing toward internal betrayal. Communications equipment was sabotaged and repaired to suggest tampering from within. Supply caches were relocated to cast suspicion on those responsible for their security. The paranoid atmosphere that kept ISIS functioning in hostile territory became a weapon against itself. By the end of the week, the refinery had become a powder keg of mutual suspicion and barely contained violence. Guards watched each other more carefully than they watched for external threats. Supply convoys arrived to find their contacts had been replaced by men they didn't trust. The smooth coordination that had made the planned civilian attacks possible began to break down as each faction suspected the others of sabotage. The psychological breaking point came when the Ghost himself became convinced that one of his senior lieutenants was planning a coup. Based on evidence carefully planted by Joanna, he ordered the execution of his most trusted subordinate, a decision that sparked open rebellion among the remaining commanders. The facility descended into civil war as different factions began shooting at each other. Joanna watched the chaos unfold from her observation post, amazed at how quickly the terrorist organization had turned on itself. Men who had been willing to die for their cause were now killing each other over imagined betrayals. The command structure that had taken months to build was collapsing in a matter of hours. The final phase of her operation began when she identified the Ghost, attempting to escape the facility in an armored vehicle. A single shot through the windshield eliminated the senior commander and sent his escort vehicle careening off the road. With their leader dead and their organization in chaos, the remaining fighters began fleeing in all directions. Kurdish forces arrived to find the refinery abandoned, except for scattered groups of ISIS fighters shooting at each other in the belief that they were facing traitors rather than enemies. The sophisticated command center that had coordinated terror attacks across 3 provinces was reduced to smoking ruins, its equipment destroyed and its personnel scattered to the winds. Most importantly, the planned civilian attacks never materialized. Without coordination from the command center, the scattered attack cells remained inactive, waiting for orders that would never come. The 200 fighters who had been positioned to strike at innocent families found themselves abandoned and isolated, easy targets for Kurdish security forces who now had their locations. Intelligence recovered from the refinery revealed the full scope of the Ghost's network and provided the locations of other command centers across the region. But more importantly, it showed how ISIS's reliance on paranoid security measures could be turned against them. The same suspicion that protected them from infiltration made them vulnerable to psychological operations that exploited their distrust of each other. Joanna's radio crackled with congratulations from Kurdish command and reports of successful raids against the abandoned attack cells. The operation that was supposed to terrorize civilian populations had instead resulted in the capture or elimination of an entire ISIS network. The Angel of Death had achieved something that conventional military operations could never accomplish, turning the enemy's greatest strength into their fatal weakness. But even as she celebrated this victory, Joanna knew that her war was entering a new phase. ISIS was adapting to her tactics, becoming more cautious and unpredictable. The next operation would require new strategies and even greater risks. The final confrontation between the Angel of Death and the forces of terror was still to come. The intelligence briefing that arrived in November contained information that made Joanna's blood run cold. ISIS had identified her as their primary threat and was planning something unprecedented in modern warfare. A massive, coordinated hunt specifically designed to eliminate a single enemy sniper. They were calling it Operation Vengeance. And they had allocated over 300 fighters to ensure the Angel of Death would never strike again. The plan was sophisticated and brutal. ISIS commanders had studied her previous operations, identified her preferred tactics, and designed countermeasures that would turn her own methods against her. They would establish multiple false targets, each designed to lure her into carefully prepared kill zones. Advanced surveillance equipment stolen from Iraqi military bases would scan the mountains for her heat signature. Captured Kurdish fighters would be tortured for information about her operations and support network. Joanna realized that everything about her war would have to change. The hit-and-run tactics that had served her so well were now anticipated and countered. Her reputation as an invisible predator had made her the most hunted person in the Middle East. ISIS was preparing to invest massive resources in operations that had no goal except her elimination. The first sign of the new reality came during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. Joanna and Ahmad were observing an ISIS supply depot when they detected electronic surveillance sweeping the area. Advanced radar and thermal imaging equipment had been positioned to detect any sniper attempting to approach the facility. What appeared to be a legitimate target was actually an elaborate trap. The realization that her enemies had evolved forced Joanna to evolve as well. Instead of retreating, she began planning an operation that would turn their trap into her weapon. If ISIS wanted to concentrate hundreds of fighters in one area to hunt her, she would give them exactly what they expected. But the hunter they found would not be the one they were prepared to fight. Working with Kurdish intelligence, Joanna developed a plan that relied on misdirection on a massive scale. They would create the impression that she was planning a major assault on the supply depot, while actually preparing to strike at a completely different target. ISIS forces rushing to defend against her expected attack would leave other facilities vulnerable to coordinated Kurdish assaults. The deception began with carefully planted intelligence, suggesting that Joanna was planning to strike during a major supply delivery scheduled for the following week. Kurdish agents allowed themselves to be captured with documents indicating detailed surveillance of the depot and plans for a precision strike against high-value targets. ISIS commanders studying this intelligence would see exactly what they expected to see: the Angel of Death preparing to walk into their trap. Meanwhile, Joanna was actually planning an assault on ISIS's regional headquarters, a fortified compound 50 kilometers away that had been stripped of defenders to support Operation Vengeance. Intelligence indicated that the facility housed not just administrative personnel, but also the strategic planning materials for future terrorist operations across the entire region. The night before the supposed supply depot attack, Joanna and a small team of elite Kurdish fighters began their approach to the real target. The headquarters compound was lightly defended, its usual garrison redeployed to support the elaborate trap waiting at the supply depot. The few remaining guards were focused on their radios, eagerly awaiting news of the famous sniper's capture. Joanna's assault on the headquarters was unlike anything she had attempted before. Instead of long-range elimination of individual targets, she led a close-quarters battle designed to capture documents and personnel alive. The psychological impact of the Angel of Death appearing where she was least expected, leading a team instead of working alone, shattered the defenders' ability to respond effectively. The compound fell within 20 minutes. Joanna personally eliminated the remaining resistance, while her team secured intelligence materials that would prove invaluable in future operations. Most importantly, they captured alive the ISIS intelligence chief responsible for Operation Vengeance, a prize that would yield information about terrorist networks across 3 countries. News of the headquarters assault reached the supply depot just as ISIS commanders realized they had been completely outmaneuvered. The 300 fighters assembled to hunt the Angel of Death found themselves guarding an empty trap while their real headquarters burned 50 kilometers away. The psychological impact was devastating. Their most sophisticated operation had been anticipated, countered, and turned against them. The captured intelligence chief provided information that led to a series of rapid strikes against ISIS facilities throughout the region. Joanna found herself coordinating multiple simultaneous operations, using her reputation and tactical expertise to support Kurdish forces attacking targets she had helped identify. The lone sniper had evolved into something approaching a force commander. But the most significant development was the effect her continued survival had on ISIS morale across the entire Middle East. Operation Vengeance had been publicized within their ranks as the campaign that would finally eliminate their most dangerous enemy. Its spectacular failure convinced many fighters that the Angel of Death was truly untouchable, protected by forces beyond human understanding. Recruitment began declining in areas where Joanna's exploits were known. Experienced fighters requested transfers away from Kurdistan, rather than risk facing the legendary sniper. Local ISIS commanders found themselves struggling to maintain discipline among troops who believed they were fighting an enemy who couldn't be killed. The psychological warfare that had begun as an unintended consequence of her marksmanship skills had evolved into a sophisticated campaign of terror against those who had once terrorized others. ISIS fighters who had joined the organization, believing in their invincibility, now faced the daily possibility of elimination by an enemy they couldn't see, predict, or escape. Joanna's radio crackled with reports from Kurdish units across the region. ISIS forces were withdrawing from multiple positions, abandoning strategic locations rather than risk confrontation with the forces she had come to represent. The tide of war was turning not because of massive military campaigns, but because a single sniper had broken the enemy's will to fight. Intelligence reports indicated that ISIS leadership was considering a complete withdrawal from Kurdistan, abandoning territory they had held for years, rather than continue facing the psychological pressure of the Angel of Death campaign. The organization that had once seemed unstoppable was being systematically dismantled by fear of a single enemy they had created through their own brutality. But Joanna knew that her greatest test was still ahead. Cornered enemies were often the most dangerous, and ISIS commanders desperate to restore their reputation might attempt something truly catastrophic. The final phase of her war would require not just tactical brilliance, but the kind of strategic thinking that could end the terrorist threat once and for all. The final confrontation came in the spring, when ISIS made one last desperate attempt to restore their shattered reputation and eliminate the sniper who had become the symbol of their defeat. Intelligence intercepts revealed that they were planning their most audacious operation yet, a massive assault on Kurdish civilian areas designed to draw Joanna into a final battle that would determine the future of the entire region. The plan was as simple as it was brutal. ISIS would concentrate their remaining forces in a fortified valley position and begin systematically executing Kurdish prisoners, broadcasting the killings live to force the Angel of Death to attempt a rescue. When she arrived, 200 of their most experienced fighters would be waiting in prepared positions with orders to take her alive for public execution. Joanna studied the intelligence reports with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through 2 years of warfare. The valley chosen for the trap was a natural amphitheater, with only one approach route, surrounded by high ground, perfect for defensive positions. Any conventional rescue attempt would result in massacre for both the rescuers and the prisoners. But ISIS commanders had made one crucial mistake. They assumed she would fight the battle they wanted, rather than the battle that needed to be fought. Working with Kurdish military leadership, Joanna developed a response that would end the ISIS threat permanently, while saving the prisoners and minimizing casualties among her own forces. The plan required precise timing, overwhelming force, and the kind of psychological warfare that had become her specialty. Most importantly, it would give the enemy exactly what they thought they wanted, while delivering something completely different. The operation began with carefully leaked intelligence, suggesting that Joanna was planning a solo rescue mission, exactly what ISIS expected from their analysis of her previous operations. Kurdish agents allowed themselves to be captured with documents indicating detailed surveillance of the valley and plans for a precision strike against the prisoner-holding area. ISIS commanders studying this intelligence saw confirmation that their trap would work perfectly. Meanwhile, the real plan involved coordinated airstrikes, artillery bombardment, and a three-pronged ground assault supported by Kurdish special forces. Joanna would indeed enter the valley, but not as a lone sniper attempting an impossible rescue. She would be the forward observer for the largest military operation Kurdistan had mounted against ISIS, turning their carefully prepared trap into their final battlefield. The deception required Joanna to make herself visible to ISIS surveillance, confirming their belief that she was attempting another solo operation. She positioned herself on the valley rim at dawn, allowing their spotters to detect her heat signature and report her location to their commanders. Everything had to appear exactly as ISIS expected until the moment their trap became their tomb. ISIS fighters in the valley began executing prisoners on schedule, broadcasting the killings to force Joanna into premature action. The psychological pressure was enormous. Watching innocent people die while waiting for the predetermined moment to begin the counterattack. But Joanna had learned that saving some lives sometimes required accepting the loss of others, a lesson that separated professional soldiers from well-meaning amateurs. At precisely 9 o'clock, as ISIS commanders congratulated themselves on forcing the Angel of Death into their trap, Kurdish artillery began falling on predetermined targets throughout the valley. The coordinates had been calculated during weeks of surveillance, identifying every defensive position, every weapons cache, every route the defenders might use to escape or reposition. Joanna's role in the massive assault was unlike anything she had done before. Instead of eliminating individual targets, she served as the eyes and ears for the artillery, adjusting fire missions and identifying new targets as the battle developed. The lone sniper had become the nerve center for an operation involving hundreds of fighters and massive firepower. The psychological impact on ISIS defenders was immediate and devastating. They had prepared for a duel with a single enemy and found themselves facing the coordinated assault of an entire military force. The trap they had spent weeks preparing became a killing field where they were the primary targets. Fighters who had expected to capture the legendary sniper found themselves fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. Within 2 hours, organized resistance in the valley had collapsed. ISIS fighters who had not been eliminated in the initial bombardment began surrendering in groups, raising white flags, and calling out their willingness to give up the fight. The organization that had once terrorized 3 countries was reduced to scattered bands of demoralized survivors begging for mercy. The most significant moment came when a group of 200 ISIS fighters, including several senior commanders, emerged from their fortified positions with their hands raised in surrender. They had been broken not just by superior firepower, but by the realization that their most sophisticated trap had been anticipated, countered, and turned against them. The Angel of Death had evolved from individual hunter to force commander, bringing the full weight of Kurdish military power against them. Joanna watched the surrender from her observation post, amazed at the transformation that had occurred over 2 years of warfare. The young woman who had left Denmark to fight individual terrorists had become the focal point for a campaign that had eliminated ISIS as an effective fighting force in Kurdistan. The psychological warfare that had begun with individual sniper operations had culminated in the collapse of an entire terrorist organization. The intelligence recovered from captured ISIS personnel revealed the full scope of their defeat. Communications intercepts showed that news of the valley surrender had spread throughout their remaining networks, causing mass defections and the abandonment of strategic positions across the region. The organization that had once seemed unstoppable was disintegrating as fighters chose survival over continued resistance. Most importantly, the rescue operation had saved over 60 Kurdish prisoners who had been slated for execution. Families that had given up hope of seeing their loved ones again were reunited with those who had survived ISIS captivity. The victory was measured not just in enemy casualties, but in lives saved and communities restored. Joanna's war officially ended 3 months later when the last organized ISIS presence was eliminated from Kurdish territory. The Danish government had long since demanded her return, threatening legal action if she continued fighting abroad. But her service had earned her something more valuable than legal immunity: the gratitude of a people who owed their freedom to her courage. The young woman who had once been called the Angel of Death by her enemies became known as the Guardian Angel by those she had protected. Her transformation from individual sniper to force commander represented something unprecedented in modern warfare: the evolution of a single fighter into a symbol powerful enough to defeat an ideology. Years later, Military strategists would study her campaign as an example of how unconventional tactics and psychological warfare could achieve results that traditional military operations could not. But for the people of Kurdistan, Joanna Polani would always be remembered as the young woman who had left safety to stand between innocent families and those who would destroy them. The angel of death had become something far more powerful, proof that courage and determination could triumph over terror and hatred.